Good. Got it. Okay. So David is quite a distinguished speaker for us. He is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He has taught at the Russian State University in Moscow and is fluent in Russian. He was telling me, taught at Brandeis, he taught at Yeshiva. He's a fellow at Hebrew University's Institute for Advanced Studies, been at the University of Pennsylvania. He has many distinguished publications and has given many talks, and we are thrilled to have him. And David, I think I'll hand it over to you at this point. Okay.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. Thank you for being brief. No, in
Well,
the introduction, I'm quite serious. I appreciate it very much. Good evening,
I could say
everybody.
a lot more about your
course.
credentials, but I think if people look you up, they will find you. Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm not in Westchester County. I'm in Manhattan, but it's nice to see many friendly faces and to be part of this, because it's very appropriate that this topic, which is the rescue of books from the Nazis, the rescue of books, manuscripts, artwork from the Nazis, and then later, as you'll hear, from the Soviets. So it's very appropriate that it be conveyed to an audience from public libraries, which are, after all, repositories and treasure houses of culture. And I'm going to talk for, I promise, no more than 40 minutes. And then I'm really happy to answer questions. This book is very dear to my heart, put in many years of research, and it's symbolically, emotionally important to me. I think that will become clear as I tell the story. Just bear with me for a minute. I have to get this into slideshow. There we are. Okay. For the full story, the book is called The Book Smugglers. It's been published in 8 languages, last year in Hebrew and next year in Russian. And I'm going to begin with an autobiographical kind of note, which a little bit will explain eventually how I came to this topic. More than 30 years ago, I'm embarrassed to say, I was a fresh PhD, a youngster out of graduate school. I had a job, but I was just an assistant professor here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I got a call from the director of the YIVO Institute. YIVO is an institute for the study of Jews in Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and for the study of Yiddish culture. And the director called me and said, you know, we just found out there's an enormous mountain of Jewish books and papers discovered in Vilnius, Lithuania. We think it belongs to our institute because this YIVO Institute was originally founded in Vilnius, then called Vilna. Will you go and look at it with me? And so this is actually more than 30 years ago, 32 years ago, 1989. It's still the Soviet Union, Soviet Lithuania. And this mountain of Jewish material was in what was called the Lithuanian book chamber, a former church, a former monastery and church. I went, and what I saw really blew me away, really stunned me. This is all obviously pre-war books, papers. And I started to dig, how did this happen? Why in 1989 am I finding this mountain of material in a former church in Lithuania? I did a few little things. I was busy with other topics, but you know, 20 years later, I came back to this and decided I could write a book on it, and found what for me was stunning surprises and twists and turns in the story. The story takes place in Vilna. Now it is the capital of independent Lithuania. Before World War II, it was in the northeastern corner of Poland. But Jews always called it Lithuania, even when it belonged to Poland or to Russia. And the community had a special name, a very Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Now not every Jewish community in history has been called Jerusalem. When that happens, it's happened 4 or 5 times. It's a special community if it is compared to Jerusalem. Its special tradition is one of book culture, of study, of reading, and that tradition was founded by this Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, who believed that the most important aspect of piety is to study the holy books, study the Bible, study the Talmud, and other classics of the religious tradition. And he made Vilna into the city of the book, the city of the Jewish book. On the left, you're seeing a volume of the Talmud, which is the second greatest, most holy book in the Jewish religious tradition after the Bible. So published in Vilna. Here in Hebrew letters, it says Vilna. And on the right, you're seeing a potpourri of mainly Yiddish newspapers and magazines. In the late 19th and 20th century, the book culture becomes more modern, more secular. So you're getting newspapers, magazines, novels, poetry. No longer are you getting, prayer books and Bibles and things like that. But the commitment to the book remains continuous. This is a drawing in the background is the Great Synagogue of Vilna, established in the 1570s. But in the foreground is the Jewish Community Library. Not a house of study in the traditional rabbinic sense, but truly a library that collected, aspired to collect all books printed in Hebrew and Yiddish. It was called the Strashun Library. This is the reading room. It had 5 Hebrew incunabula. Incunabula are books printed before 1501. Since printing came into being in the 1400s and Hebrew printing only in the late 1400s, in Hebrew, incunabula are very rare, and the Strashun Library had 5 of them. It was the greatest library under Jewish auspices in Europe before World War II. This city also had a great Jewish archive in this Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, I already mentioned it, which is, collections of documents by great writers, political leaders, organizations, communities. So history was stored in this archive, the Yiddish Institute in Vilna, which also had a reading room and all kinds of courses. There were many collections and great collections of rarities in this city, and I've just listed many types of institutions that had them. Finally, I will mention, the city was not only a repository of books, but it was a center of literary creativity. This is a Yiddish language literary group called Jung Vilna. These are poets, novelists, a couple of plastic artists, a very eclectic group. 2 of these writers are very important for the story I'm going to tell you. They have hard names, I apologize. This one in the center was called Shmerke Kaczerginski. I'm just going to call him Shmerke. He was the life of the group, the heart of the group. He kept it together, this literary group. Literary groups are hard to hold together. He was a man of the left. He was a member of the underground Communist Party in Vilna. An orphan, grew up in an orphanage. It doesn't often happen that someone grows up in an orphanage and becomes a a poet and writer, but he did. Next to him, his best friend, Abraham Sutzkever, also a poet, but totally apolitical, writes nature poetry, writes poems about trees and about snow, and says, I'm not a communist, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a Zionist. My only ideology is poetry. He'll become the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. Okay, that's all as background, so you know where this story takes place, what kind of place it is. Now I'm going to the heart of the story, which is Vilna under the Nazi occupation and the Vilna Ghetto. The Germans reached this city, which is after all in northeastern Poland, late. They only arrived in the war against the Soviet Union, June 1941, not in 1939, but in 1941. They came later, but they worked, as far as their treatment of the Jews, very efficiently and very quickly. In September of 1941, 2 months later, they created the Vilna Ghetto. Actually, originally, as you can see, 2 ghettos, because all Jews were herded into these 7 streets here and 3 streets here. But this was ghetto number 2 in the north there. But ghetto number 2 did not last long. It was liquidated after 6 weeks. All of its inhabitants in ghetto number 2 were sent to their deaths. This is late 1941. There were not yet death camps like Auschwitz with, gas chambers and crematoria. This is the Far East, and therefore the method of murder, mass murder, was what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. People were rounded up, sent to the outskirts of the town where there were pits, and they were shot at close range into the pits. And the place, the mass murder site outside of Vilna, was called Ponar. The Germans, the Jewish population of Vilna on the eve of the German occupation was 70,000. It may not sound very large, but it was nonetheless, it was the 4th largest Jewish community in Poland before the war. 70,000. That 70,000 represented about 1/3 of the city's total population. It's a very high proportion. 1/3 of the city was Jewish. Of those 70,000, 50,000 were murdered in just 6 months' time. From July till December of 1941, more than 2/3 of the Jews were murdered by being sent to Ponar. And then in January 1942, the murdering stopped. And instead, you get a year and a half of stability, relative stability. That is, there are still atrocities, but they're not on the massive and systematic scale of the first 6 months. And instead, the Jews of the ghetto are being used as slave laborers. Most of the places they work are outside the ghetto. And every day they leave the ghetto gate, this is the gate, to their workplace. And every evening they come back to the ghetto. And of course, because official food rations are very meager, a starvation diet, the main thing working inmates want to do is smuggle food into the ghetto under their clothing. And they do that with greater or lesser success, depending actually who's at the gate. There are 3 potential types of guards. There are Lithuanian police. There is Jewish ghetto police, an imposed police force on the ghetto population of Jews. And then there are German guards, and sometimes even high-ranking German officials. And depending who's at the gate, it's either easy or hard to smuggle food in, but people were sent to their deaths because they had a loaf of bread, a potato, or a bag of peas under their clothing. Okay, now I'm coming to the body of the story itself. I need to tell you about this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or the Rosenberg Special Detail. This is the agency for looting books and documents, the Nazi agency for looting cultural treasures all across Europe. The Nazis believe, since they're the master race, they should have the greatest library, the greatest academy, the greatest of everything. It should all belong to them. And they looted, including art. And if you saw the movie Monuments Men, or read, better yet, the book, you know something about how extensive Nazi looting of art, but not only of art, also of books and of documents, was all across Europe. What is not very well known is that this organization, the ERR, the Rosenberg Detail, this organization had a special department for Judaica. And by Judaica, they meant books in Hebrew and in Yiddish, in Jewish, in the Hebrew alphabet. And they looted and stole Judaica books from all across Europe, from Paris, from Amsterdam, from Vienna, even from Salonika. This is Dr. Johannes Paul, who's the head of the Judaica department of the ERR. Now you may ask, what are they doing that? They're murdering Jews, yet they're collecting, so to speak, collecting Jewish books. What's the point in that? Shouldn't they just be burning it all? The answer is the Germans, the Nazi Germans, had a field of scholarship they called Judenforschung, study of the Jews. And there were institutes for the study of the Jewish question. And the point was, the Germans wanted to prove scientifically, quote unquote, that the Jews were evil, depraved, a threat, and a menace, subhuman. But they wanted to prove all of this in scientific terms. And for that, you needed specialists who would write from every field of the humanities and social sciences, whether they were historians or religious scholars or anthropologists or sociologists. Every field, there would be scholars, specialists on the Jews to legitimize in scientific terms the persecution and extermination of the Jews. Paul was fluent in, he knew biblical Hebrew, he knew modern Hebrew, he knew Yiddish. He had spent a few years in Jerusalem before the rise of Nazi Germany, and he runs this operation. Paul knows, I guess, let me just show you one other thing. You can see here, this is a Hebrew book, but in the corner is a stamp, and it says Institut NSDA Erforschung der Judenfrage. This is the Institute for the Investment, with a Nazi swastika, stolen, looted book that ends up. This institute is in Frankfurt in Germany. Okay, Paul knows that Vilna is a very important place on the map as far as Jewish books are concerned. He knows about the Strashun Library, about the Yivo Yiddish Institute, and he actually shows up in Vilna 2 weeks after the Wehrmacht, after the German army conquered the city. Well, I'll have to go back to explain. When he shows up in Vilna, he is stunned by how many books there are, how many libraries, how many collections. And it's hundreds of thousands of books, and he doesn't really know what to do, because he also knows there are duplicates, triplicates, quadruplicates. He doesn't need to send 10 copies of the same book to Frankfurt. He can't pack everything and send everything. There's no need to. So he needs a system to sort. what valuable books and papers should be sent to Frankfurt, and what the rest, of course, should be destroyed, just treated like trash. But who can sort that? Who can do that selection? Yes, it is this kind of selection process of which books should be deported and which ones should be destroyed. Only Jews. There aren't a lot of Johannes Pauls out there in Germany. So he creates a slave labor brigade of Jews who will do this job for him. And they're given a quota. Only 30% can be sent to Germany. 70% is going to be destroyed. And this slave labor brigade gets the nickname the Paper Brigade. And I'm going to introduce you now. These are Jewish slave laborers, all of them intellectuals, who are being forced to do this selection process. If it's valuable, put it in a pile for Germany. If it's not valuable, at least according to the Germans' criteria of valuable and not valuable, then it goes in another pile and it will be sent actually for recycling at like a paper mill. The head of this brigade is Herman Crook. He's a professional librarian. He was from Warsaw. He headed the largest Jewish library in Warsaw, and a socialist, a man belonged to the Jewish Socialist Party, the Bund. And because he's a professional librarian, the Germans appointed him to head the brigade. His deputy is a scholar from the YIVO, from the Yiddish Institute, Zela Kalmanovich. He is, at this stage in his life, a Zionist. His son, Sholem, lives in British Mandatorial Palestine. And he's become, just on the eve of the war, a believer and a religious person. So the two heads really are very different from each other, but they work together. Now, for our purposes, these two people, we've seen them before. These are the same two poets we saw in that earlier picture of Jung Vilna. Schmerke, the orphan, the communist, the life of the party on the left, and Sutzkever, the nature poet on the right. They are also, they joined this brigade. They are hired for this brigade. In all, there were 20 intellectuals and 20 technical workers who worked for this paper brigade. The intellectuals that range, the whole range. Yes, there are scholars, there are writers, there are educators, there are a couple of artists, there's a musicologist, of the surviving intelligence, Jewish intelligence of Vilna, now that more than 2/3 of the community has been murdered. Finally, the last person I want to introduce you from this paper brigade is this woman in the middle, Rachella Krinsky. She is a high school teacher of history at the best Jewish high school in Vilna. She has a master's degree from Vilna University, but she has a very poignant and special personal story. Her husband was murdered literally a week or two after the Germans came in the very earliest roundups. She's left alone with their almost 2-year-old daughter. She goes, when the order is given that all Jews must go to the ghetto, she decides she's not taking her daughter into the ghetto. She hands her daughter over to her Polish nanny and says to the nanny, you take her. You take care of her. And the nanny moves to another part of town and passes this girl off as if it was her own daughter. So Rachella moves into the ghetto alone. No husband, no daughter. All she has is friends, and these poets are her best friends. These are the same two poets now with Rachella Krinsky. She won't see that daughter for the remainder of the war. Okay, and the work is excruciating for them. These are book lovers being forced to be complicit in the destruction of books, of their own culture. And there were people who refused to do this job because they couldn't stand it emotionally, especially when the bulldozers came and took away mountains of books and materials. And as they work, I would say on the most fundamental level, they can't live with themselves. They have to find a third way. That is, it can't be only deportation to Germany or destruction. They must find a way to rescue and to hide material. Maybe the most excruciating thing for them to see is an unusual category of material, Torah Scrolls. The scroll that is read of the 5 books of Moses that's read in the synagogue on Saturdays is the holiest object in the Jewish religion. But the Torah Scrolls are made out of parchment, which is leather. And the Nazis realized leather isn't paper. You don't just throw it away. So it is valuable. And they use the parchment, they cut up the Torah Scrolls into little pieces to use as inserts into to repair Nazi army boots. And this image, which is the level of desecration, and I think it also must convey the level of anger and fury that this group wanted to do something so that not everything be destroyed or desecrated. Now, the main way they rescue material is to do what everybody was doing. You hide it. The other people were hiding potatoes under their clothing and then taking it into the ghetto. They did the same. It just wasn't potatoes. It was little books, or it was documents. Winter is much better than summer, of course, but you can, yes, you can create like a diaper that is, under your trousers. A lot of things got around your waist. If it's winter and boots, inside your boots. Of course, everything will depend on who's at the gate, and there's a lot of peril there. When there are Germans at the gate, you can be killed for taking in books to the Vilna Ghetto, just like food. And I can't go into all the stories, but there are many dramatic stories of moments at the gate. And in general, I would say the members of the group had a lot of luck. Even in the sense that even when they were caught, they were beaten mercilessly, but nobody was sent to their death, even if and usually they were not caught. Usually they were able to get by when there were no Germans at the gate. There was one other, there are many ways, I can't go through the whole list of how they rescued material. I'll go into another way in a minute. Once in the ghetto, they hide the books in a bunker. You entered through a manhole, you went down a ladder, and this bunker was specially constructed. It held 2 things. It held books and papers, and it also held arms, guns, because there was an underground resistance organization in the Vilna Ghetto that was planning to have a great Vilna Ghetto uprising, and they are collecting and smuggling in pistols and bullets. And so you have these 2 representations of resistance, kind of the armed resistance and spiritual or cultural resistance, literally in crates next to each other in this bunker. I wanted to mention one other way material was rescued. It's a very odd kind of story. That is with the help of non-Jewish friends and neighbors. Ona Shemaita, an ethnic Lithuanian who rescued a great deal of material. The easiest way for non-Jewish friends and neighbors to help was as follows. The Germans left for the lunch hour. The work site of this brigade was actually in the former YIVO building. It's outside the ghetto. The work site is left unprotected, unguarded during the lunch hour. Now, you don't have to worry that anybody will escape, because if anybody escapes, everybody else will be killed. If everybody escapes, all their families will be killed. So, there's collective responsibility here, collective reprisal. And where will you go, even if you do escape, not obvious where you go in Nazi-occupied Poland. So no one escapes. And that's why the Nazis just leave it unguarded in the lunch hour. But that meant that non-Jewish friends and neighbors could actually visit these workers during the lunch hour and take away um, papers, books, manuscripts. And Ona Shemaitya did that to a large degree. Okay, I've got to move the story forward. Our poets survive. These are the same two poets. They survive because they belong to the armed resistance, and the armed resistance whisked them out of the Vilna Ghetto a week before the Vilna Ghetto was dissolved. When we say dissolved or liquidated, it means all the remaining inmates are either sent to labor camps or to death camps or just to mass murder sites. So the remaining 20,000 were, virtually all of them were finished off in September 1943, but the poets were able to leave a week beforehand, actually through the sewage system and out into the forests. They'll survive. The heads of this brigade that I showed you their pictures at the beginning, the librarian who was a socialist, the scholar who was a Zionist and religious, they perish. Most of the members of the 40 members, 20 intellectuals, 20 technical, over 30 perished. And they're sent to death camps in Estonia. Rachella Krinsky, with her daughter, was lucky in a sense. She was sent to a labor camp, Stutthof, near Danzig. It was a labor camp which later was converted into a death camp. It was an overflow camp for Auschwitz in 1944. So she saw the smoke going up from crematoria. She knew what was happening. She expected to die, but her turn didn't come. She survives, but she survives a very broken woman. I found her letters to the poets right after she's liberated from the Stutthof camp, and they're full of despair. She says, can't find any meaning in this life. I see other people are starting to date and get married and fall in love. And I think to myself, I don't even know what that means. She has only one healthy instinct, and that is she wants to reunite with her daughter. That's how she'll do that, I'll explain. She will eventually succeed and reunite with her daughter. The Soviets liberate Vilna from the Nazis in July 1944. The city, well, especially the Jewish quarter of the city, is in ruins. This is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon in ruins. This is the YIVO, the Yiddish Institute's building in ruins. The poets survive and they come back. They're not coming back to look for relatives. They know all their relatives have been murdered. They're not coming back to claim, I don't know, real estate or property. They're coming back to retrieve the books that they buried in that bunker and in many different hiding places in the Vilna Ghetto. And they create this retrieval operation. And whatever surviving Jews there are who return to the city participate on a volunteer basis with these hand wagons. And you can see there are sculptures and there are documents and there are at least fragments of Torah scrolls. And there are mountains of newspapers and there is art, and they collect all of this. And they create, in late July 1944, a Jewish museum in Vilna. Where is this Jewish museum? It's actually in the territory of the former ghetto, of a Nazi-imposed ghetto. That's the only place they could find an empty building. And you could see that it had a large courtyard, and on the right, I think you can see that image of somebody running. That's because the courtyard was in the ghetto years used as a sports field. It was a sports field in the Vilna Ghetto for both for team sports and for athletics. Anyway, there was so much material they collected, and that they not only kept material indoors, but a lot of mountains and mountains of material in this courtyard as they retrieve it from many different places. What they hadn't thought about was Vilnius, as the city is now called, is part of the Soviet Union. It's not, it's controlled and will remain part of the Soviet Union. And the head of the Lithuanian Bureau of the Communist Party is Mikhail Suslov, who is a close younger associate of Joseph Stalin. And Suslov is dead bent against any Jewish cultural institutions existing in the Soviet Union, in Lithuania, which is his bailiwick. And he wants to close down this museum. And there's a lot of harassment. They can't get glass, they can't get nails, they can't get furniture, they can't get paid. The KGB comes in and says, you know, you can't show these books to anybody until they pass censorship. And we don't have censors that can read Hebrew and Yiddish. So in short, the KGB says to them, you can hold on to these books, but can't show them to any readers. And the poets come to realize that the material is in danger again. At best, it's imprisoned and maybe it will be destroyed. They think of that especially because one night the trash administration, basically garbage trucks, came into the courtyard and collected mountains of material and threw it away as trash. And then they realized Suslov's no better than Paul. The Soviets are not, in this perspective, not better than the Nazis, and we must rescue the material again. And they, here I'll be brief, they smuggle the material. They leave Soviet Lithuania for neighboring Poland, and they smuggle the material through all kinds of devices, suitcases with false bottoms and other means, across the border from Soviet Lithuania to Poland. And our poets are now in Poland. There are the two on the left-hand side here. And but Poland is not a very great place for them to be. Right after the war, there are pogroms, anti-Jewish riots in Poland, most famous being in Kielce in July 1946. So they decide to leave Poland. Eventually, they go to France, different places. Everywhere they go, they take the materials with them. And eventually, the materials will end up mainly in New York, where the YIVO reconstituted itself. Those members associated with it rebuilt the YIVO in New York. And so the material from the Vilna YIVO goes to the New York YIVO. And some of the material ended up in Palestine, which would become shortly Israel. Rachella Krinsky also went to Poland, and her Polish nanny from Vilna crossed over with the daughter and brought the daughter to Rachella Krinsky. It was a very difficult reunion because this girl didn't remember who this woman was. She was less than 2 years old when they separated. She's now 6. She considers the nanny her mother. There's a difficult triangular relationship there. But after several months, Rachella is able to write in a letter, you know, I've done it. She's my daughter again, and I'm her mother again. The Jewish Museum was closed down. That is, Suslov had his way, and everything was dumped into the basement of the Lithuanian book chamber. And it lay there, for various reasons, lay in the basement of the book chamber for more than 40 years. In other words, this material was dumped there in the late 1940s. And I, with my colleagues, came there in 1989 and discovered it. Now I want to finish up with 2 quick things. One is to tell you, what did they rescue? I keep on talking about books and papers, documents, cultural treasures. I want to give you some examples. This is a diary by Theodor Herzl. the father of Zionism, of the modern Zionism, a diary from the 1880s before he led and formed the Zionist movement. This was held by Ivo and rescued. This is the record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. That synagogue was destroyed. I actually showed you a picture of the ruins, but the minute book, the record book, spans 150 years of records and of history. These are rare little Yiddish books. The one on the right is interesting, Prayers for Childbirth. Those prayers that a woman can say as she's in labor. Letters by the great writer Sholem Aleichem, right, who wrote Tevye the Dairyman, which became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. A bust of Leon Tolstoy, which was made from life, in other words, in person. Tolstoy posed for the Jewish sculptor Ilya Ginsburg. And much material from the ghetto period itself, not only because they realized that what was happening to them was historic, and they collected everything they could from their own immediate time. So you have, and there was a rich cultural life in the Vilna Ghetto. So you have a concert program from the orchestra of the Vilna Ghetto, or a call to arms from the resistance of the Vilna Ghetto. So that gives you a sense of the variety of material they rescued. Finally, what happened to these people in their later lives? Sutzkever, the nature poet, settled in Israel and had a long and illustrious career as a poet in Yiddish. He was read by Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, Zalman Shazar, President of Israel, was awarded the Israel Prize, which is the greatest award. Okay, he took much of the material with him to Israel. Kaczerginsky is no longer a communist. His experiences after the war totally disillusioned him of communism. He wanted to come to the United States, but the Americans authorities thought he was a communist and wouldn't let him in. He ended up settling in Buenos Aires in Argentina, heading a Jewish cultural organization there. And when he took the job, he said, you know, I know what commitment to culture is. I know it from my and my colleagues' experiences in the paper brigade. And I promise you the same level of devotion and commitment that we showed in the paper brigade. I'll promise the same here in Buenos Aires. Last, Rachella Krinsky came to New York. She had a brother here in New York. And lo and behold, she remarried. Something she could never have imagined beforehand. She met a fellow survivor of the Vilna Ghetto. And she came with her daughter. She raised that daughter. They lived in New Jersey, some years in Teaneck, New Jersey, not just across the river from where I am. And she lived to see the growing up of her granddaughter, who actually today lives in Berkeley, California. So these are very special kinds of heroes, people who are willing to literally risk their lives for books, for documents, for manuscripts every day for a year and a half, I should say. This operation went on for a year and a half. And if a definition of a hero is someone who's willing to risk their life and pay with their life for a noble cause larger than themselves, they weren't thinking about rescuing themselves. They were thinking about something else. Then these people definitely qualify as heroes. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I have, excuse me, I have a question, David. What happened to the Incanava?
The Incanavia, the 5 books from before 1500,
Mhm.
They were never found. They have never been found. And it's assumed that somebody stole them, probably a German officer, but it's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Professor,
Yes.
do you have any, I know this is a huge question, but do you have any ideas about how we could all keep this from happening again? Because I smell it in our country and I'm afraid. I'm afraid for the Jewish population. I'm afraid for all minorities.
I
I
can't,
know.
I can't say I have a magic solution other than vigilance. And you're being worried and afraid is the first step towards making sure this kind of barbarity never repeats itself. You know, all these stories are cautionary stories.
Thank you.
Don't be
And
shy.
you may have said it earlier, but where does your family come from?
Oh, no, I didn't say that. My family is not from Lithuania. My parents are American born. My grandparents were born in different parts of Eastern Europe, mainly Ukraine, what today is Moldova, which is near Ukraine, Poland, Hungary. My four grandparents come from different places. So I don't have a personal family connection to that city of Vilna, but I always knew, even as a student, that it was in a very important place on the map. But now, once having researched and studied this story, you know, I do feel a special bond, even though I am not, you know, genetically a Litvak, meaning a Lithuanian Jew.
Thank you.
Did Paul show any sympathy at all as a scholar?
No, Paul, well, a very interesting question. What happened to Paul? Paul was briefly arrested after the war. He was held for like 6 months by the British and then released. He was in other words, he lived on. He kept a low profile. He knew himself that if he kept a low profile after that, he was like a copy editor for a publishing house. In other words, he never had any aspirations after the war to get a good job with a library or with a university or anything like that, because if he had gone for a prominent job, they'd have to review his past, they would have discovered, and he could have then been put on trial. So he kept a low profile, and therefore lived out his years in quiet. He went back to his native town. He wasn't in Berlin, but it's quite remarkable that Paul he didn't address, he tried to forget that chapter or help everybody else forget that chapter. He never addressed what he did during the war, and he was never punished for what he did during the war, which is, you know, the destruction of a whole culture. So that is remarkable.
David, have you been back to Vilna or Vilnius? And have you researched anything more in that area?
I go back. I have been going back. I even went this summer. As you remember, June and July were good months for the pandemic, before the Delta variant. So I do go periodically back and do research there. And the book has been translated into Lithuanian and has elicited a good deal of interest among the population there. There are very few Jews left in Lithuania today. I think now they say 3,000. in all of Lithuania, not only, though it's mainly Vilna, Vilnius. So it's a small Jewish community. There's a remnant. And hopefully more young Lithuanians will be interested in the Jewish past of their city and of their country.
Is there any remorse amongst the people for the ghetto and the?
Well, let's be clear. The primary responsibility for the ghetto and for the Holocaust is with the Germans. That must be said. There were Lithuanian collaborators. There were collaborators in every country in Europe. But this story I told you, the only Lithuanian involved in my story about the paper brigade, the only Lithuanian involved is a heroine, that Ona Shemaitė. I would never generalize about any ethnic group. There were villains and there were heroes. In this specific story about the fate of Jewish books and cultural treasures, the one Lithuanian was a true heroine.
Amazing.
David, why were the poets treated differently early on?
What do you mean? Why were the scholars treated
They
differently?
were allowed out of the ghetto.
Oh, no, that's not being treated differently. In other words, most work brigades were outside the ghetto. As I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, lots and lots of ghetto inhabitants left in the morning for work. It could be a factory, it could be the railway station, or anywhere they could, even the outskirts of town to chop trees. And then they returned at the end of the day. So therefore, this brigade was treated like any other labor brigade. Leave in the morning, come back in the evening. There were a couple of questions. Any idea what important or unique books were among those destroyed? No, that's very hard to reconstruct. Let me just say that, no, even the members of the paper brigade, if they couldn't rescue a book, if they couldn't hide it, then they sent it to Germany in the hopes that it would be discovered after the war. So as a generalization, I don't think the most valuable things were destroyed. In general, the most valuable things were either rescued or sent to Germany. Here, let me add, the material that was sent to Germany, quite paradoxically, was discovered after the war by the US military. Frankfurt came under US control, and they discovered the place where the Germans kept all these Judaica books. And the US military returned those books to the YIVO in New York. So quite paradoxically, everything that the Germans looted and sent to Germany ended up coming to the United States of America intact. Was there a paper brigade in other ghettos like Warsaw? Nothing quite equivalent. Again, because Vilna was a special place on the map with this rich tradition of libraries and publishing and study, the Germans invested a lot of energy there. And so you have other great stories of resistance, but not the kind that I described to you in the Vilna Ghetto.
Have you had any contact with any of the survivors?
Oh, yes. My book is mainly based on written sources. That is, all these heroes either wrote diaries in the ghetto or memoirs after the ghetto. I used, just explaining, but I did do some interviews. There weren't that many of them alive, but I was able to track down 2 or 3 people who worked in this brigade and talk to them. One of them became my good friend, Michael Mencken. he worked in this brigade as a technical worker. He was a teenager, he was a youngster. In other words, he carried boxes and crates and, nailed them closed and things like that. He was no intellectual, but he worked for a couple of months on the technical end of this brigade, and he could really enlighten me about certain things that I didn't find in any source. I'm very pleased that he lived to see the book published, and I mentioned him in the book. He passed away 2 years ago. Yeah, so I did, and there are very few survivors of the Vilna Ghetto left by now. The last, but I knew many of them. I knew many of them over the years.
Have you been to Israel to see any of the valuable pieces that might have gotten to Israel?
No, definitely. There are a lot of the material Sutzkever donated to the, I went there because they're at the National Library of Israel. Yes, I spent a lot of time, as I was mentioning before we came on to Carolyn, the research for this book was done, in the States, here in New York and in Washington, D.C., either at the Holocaust Museum, also at the National Archives. So in the United States, in Lithuania, in Vilnius, and in Israel. Those were my, everything else, I didn't go there. I went to Moscow, and there was material in Moscow, but anything else, I ordered copies. And but there is especially a lot of the ghetto material that they rescued. The ghetto archive, you could call it, is in Jerusalem.
Does Yad Vashem have some?
Yad Vashem has something, but not as much as both poets actually donated their personal papers to Yad Vashem. So there is material at Yad Vashem.
What is the book chamber where they were just deposited? And it looked like it was in the basement of St. George's Church or something.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well, first of all, this is the Soviet Union where they don't like religion. So they converted a church into a cultural institution, right? And the book chamber is a kind of unique thing we don't have in America. It's a book archive. Book archive means you get one copy of every possible book you can find. All right, that was its purpose. It's not really for circulation. It's not really a library. Anyway, the book chamber was the national book archive of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. And it no longer exists. And in fact, very appropriately, the building was given back to the Catholic Church. It's now a church again. But back then, when I went in 1989, it was still, and again, you knew it was a church. There were still crucifixes on the walls. They hadn't changed the building. They were just using it as a storage facility for books. Well, these have been wonderful questions. And if anybody wants to ask me other ones by, you can find me by email or just pass them on to Carolyn, and she'll pass them on to me. As you can tell, this is more than a book for me. This is a real labor of love and a real message that preserving culture is a holy mission. And it's all underappreciated. Anytime we hold a book in our hands, we should, especially an older one, we need to remember that, how lucky we are that we have it, especially if it's older and from Europe, that we are truly fortunate to have this legacy, and we should cherish it.
David, I would just like to say publicly, I think they're still on here. I didn't know about the book. I don't think Carolyn did either until Ruth Fishback, who is on the library visiting committee, highly recommended it, and we read it, and Carolyn invited you to come. And I think it's terribly important that we have these people who are working as kind of our halos for libraries to help us focus on what is important and to find the things that may not be on the top of the bestseller list, but the subjects that are tremendously urgent for people to know about, particularly in today's climate, lest it not happen again,
Okay, thank
Never again.
ever
but-
again.
Are there any more questions for David? What is your next project? Is there
Oh,
something else?
I don't think I can leave Vilna. I just think I'll stay in Vilna. I don't think I'll ever write a book like this again, because this is my first general interest book. But I think I will, in other words, I got to go back to being a professor and writing academic books that many less people read. But I think I will stay on something about the history of the Jews of Vilna.
This should really be a movie. I think it would be a great documentary or some sort of wonderful movie.
There will be a documentary. There's a documentary will be out another year or so, which is on various forms of Holocaust resistance. And one of the 3 or 4 case studies they have for this documentary is the Paper Brigade. And that's why I was in Vilnius this last summer to film with them. So it will be I don't know, an hour and a half film with 25 minutes or so on this story.
Great, great.
David, just a comment. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Beautifully delivered. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate
John,
it.
Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, and Ruth, for suggesting this, because it's been a wonderful evening. And David, thank you. Are there any more questions? Because David has offered to stay generously as long as anybody has any further questions. Otherwise, I think we should all get this book, and we own a couple of copies of it at the library, and the other libraries do as well. And there are a lot of independent bookstores around in Ridgefield, in Pleasantville, in Chappaqua, and lots of other Westchester communities around here. So you should make your way to these bookstores and buy a copy of this book. And thank you, David. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming.
It's
Thank you
been
for a wonderful
great.
evening.
Okay, be well, all of you. Take care.
Be well, everyone.